This community will not tolerate vigilantism.
Guilty as charged!
Guilty as charged.
The first time I saw her near my property, she was holding a clipboard like it was a weapon, staring at my driveway with the kind of intensity most people reserve for house fires or hostage situations. I knew right away this woman was going to be a problem. She hadn't even said a word to me yet, but her eyes scanned the padlock on my side gate, the fencing around my utility shed, and most importantly, the black four-door Jeep Wrangler parked under a camo tarp near the pine line, as if she were casing the place for a raid. I remember thinking, here comes another one. Another self-appointed HOA enforcer on a mission to prove she owns everything within her gaze. But I didn't know then just how far she was willing to go. I definitely didn't know she would. Break into my property, cut a police-registered lock, and tow a government-issued surveillance Jeep right out of my yard, setting off a chain reaction that would get her slapped with multiple felony charges and draw in a federal task force. If you think HOA Karens can't get any worse, think again, because this one went from clipboard to cuffs faster than any story I've ever witnessed. And if you're into real justice served ice cold, hit that subscribe button to Sham Stories right now, because you're not going to want to miss how this unfolds. Now let's back it up just a bit. My name is Eric Dawson, former narcotics officer turned field logistics coordinator for a multi-jurisdictional police task force operating in and around Central Tennessee. I live about 20 miles outside of Knoxville in a private residential area called Mill Creek Preserve. It's not gated, but it's governed by a board of homeowners that likes to pretend it's a suburban utopia, where the grass must be green, the driveway is spotless, and the fences all match. I bought my property 4 years ago specifically because it sat on the outer edge of the neighborhood, bordering state forest, and with a long gravel driveway that winds past a natural tree line before curving up to my actual house. My land is fenced in, legally zoned, and secured with 2 cameras and a locked side gate, mainly because the black Jeep isn't just a Jeep. It's an undercover vehicle registered through the Department for Fieldwork containing encrypted GPS, hidden dash cams, and pre-installed police gear that's not supposed to be tampered with by civilians. The Jeep had been parked on my private lot for a few weeks, part of a rolling operation we were running involving rural drug traffic corridors. Oh, I never made a big deal out of it. I kept it covered, out of sight, even padlocked the access gate just to prevent any confusion. But confusion wasn't the problem. Karen was. Karen Mitchell, to be exact, the new HOA president voted in after the last board was disbanded for misusing dues to pave their own driveways. She moved into the neighborhood 6 months earlier and immediately began reshaping it like a dictator. In a pastel cardigan, everything was suddenly about uniformity, aesthetic control, and cooperative optics. I kept to myself, mostly ignored the notices, until she showed up that day with her clipboard and eyes like hawks. She didn't introduce herself, didn't even knock. She walked straight up to my gate, yanked on the padlock, and peered through. The slats like she was inspecting a crime scene. When I came out onto the porch and asked if I could help her, she turned sharply and said, "Yes, this vehicle is not registered with HOA records. It appears to be abandoned." I explained it was not her concern that it was parked on private land, and reminded her that I had no obligation to report anything to the HOA under Tennessee State Property Code. She didn't like that. Her face tightened like she'd just bitten a lemon. Every vehicle visible from public view must be listed and tagged. That is the rule, I responded flatly. Well, good thing it's not visible unless you're trespassing. Then I asked her to leave. She stared at me for a few seconds longer and then said, "We'll see," before turning around and marching back up the drive like she'd just been insulted. Over the next several days, she began escalating. I got notices poorly written, clearly homemade, with the HOA letterhead photocopied onto them, claiming violations for excessive fencing, improper vehicle storage, and inappropriate use of camouflage coverings. My lawyer laughed when I showed him the photos. "This isn't code enforcement, it's harassment." I filed a cease and desist through the HOA's property dispute resolution line and thought that would be the end of it. But Karen wasn't interested in legality. She was interested in domination. One Friday morning, I left early for a planning meeting at the task force headquarters. I returned around 3 p.m. to find my gate wide open, the chain on the ground, and the Jeep gone. At first I thought it had been stolen. I raced to my cameras, checked the footage, and what I saw made my jaw drop. At 10:17 a.m., a white pickup with a rental tow dolly pulled up just outside my drive. Karen stepped out, dressed in full HOA, branded polo and visor, holding a bolt cutter. She cut the chain, wheeled the gate open, walked directly to the Jeep, nodded at a man I didn't recognize, probably hired help, and within 10 minutes, they had it strapped, tilted, and loaded onto the dolly. She stuck a bright orange sticker on my fence that read "Vehicle removed, HOA non-compliance," and drove off. She didn't even try to hide her face. It was all on video, every second of it. I called the sheriff immediately, then my department's field commander. They both responded at the same time. Within the hour, we had a full unit dispatched to Karen's residence, which turned out to be just 5 blocks away in the same community. I stayed at the property, compiling footage, copies of her notices, and documentation. When I got the call, it wasn't what I expected. Karen had not only towed the Jeep, she'd arranged for it to be parked in the HOA storage lot. That lot was unlocked, unsecured, and directly next to a public park. A government-registered undercover vehicle had been illegally seized and stored in plain view near a children's play area. By the time the task force arrived to reclaim it, someone had already attempted to pry the glove box open. They pulled fingerprints, took photos, and cataloged everything. The Jeep was impounded again, this time for evidence, and the sheriff's office filed an immediate criminal complaint against Karen for trespassing, property theft, and tampering with a law enforcement asset. But it didn't stop there. Because once the story reached internal affairs, they opened a federal inquiry. Karen had unknowingly compromised a multi-agency operation, and now she wasn't just looking at local charges, she was being investigated by the feds. And all because she thought my Jeep didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. What happened next? Let's just say Karen learned the hard way what it feels like when the law doesn't work in your favor, when even the clipboard can't save you from the handcuffs. Karen's public disgrace should have ended it, but instead seemed to ignite something darker inside her, something more vengeful than anyone anticipated. In the days following the court hearing, she didn't retreat quietly or show remorse. No, she doubled down with fury. Even without her HOA authority, Karen began operating in secret, reaching out to sympathetic neighbors and spinning a narrative that she was being targeted by the government for exposing suspicious activity. She claimed I was part of a deeper conspiracy and that the Jeep was planted on my property as part of a false flag operation. It would have been laughable if she hadn't managed to convince a handful of easily rattled residents who already harbored distrust of law enforcement. Karen used social media like a weapon, posting cryptic messages, blurry screenshots of my property, and even an old photo of me in uniform cropped to make it seem threatening. The local rumor mill, already shaky after her arrest, began to swirl again. Then came the midnight disruptions. The first time, I woke to the sound of gravel crunching near my side fence. I checked the monitors, nothing. The second time, my motion sensors were triggered. And when I reviewed the footage, I saw a hooded figure crouching near the camera post, trying to disable the wiring. I submitted everything to the sheriff's department. They increased patrols and agreed to place a marked cruiser in the area at random intervals. But the intimidation kept escalating. One morning, I stepped outside to find a bright red police imposter sign staked into my yard. The sign had HOA-style formatting, as if it were another compliance notice. A neighbor down the street had her door egged after posting online. In support of me, another found slashed tires. It didn't take long for deputies to trace the flyers, messages, and threats back to Karen's remaining allies, including a man named Dennis, a former HOA treasurer with a history of harassment complaints. They were interviewed and warned, and one was arrested for vandalism. But Karen herself remained just outside, reach careful, manipulative, and emboldened by every delay in prosecution. Meanwhile, the federal audit of her previous HOA activities uncovered even more disturbing facts. In her 6 months as president, Karen had funneled over $12,000 in HOA funds into unauthorized neighborhood beautification contracts. all paid to a landscaping company that didn't exist. That money was never recovered. Worse, she'd falsified meeting minutes, staged board member votes via email without consent, and threatened elderly residents with eviction for minor infractions. She was a one-woman machine of intimidation, and somehow she'd made a few people believe she was the victim. The DA opened a second criminal case, this one based on fraud and embezzlement. Karen was finally arrested again, this time without fanfare, taken quietly from her home as a few remaining loyalists filmed and shouted about tyranny. The court placed her under house arrest with GPS monitoring while they prepared for the new trial. I thought that would be the end of it, I really did. But then I got a call from the task force's legal department. Someone had tried to request public disclosure of the Jeep's internal data location history, camera logs, mission tags under the guise of a civilian Freedom of Information request. That data was classified and tied to open investigations. We traced the submission back to a masked email created 2 days after Karen's first court loss. The IP originated from within a coffee shop 5 miles from her house, Denise's regular hangout. That was the moment we realized Karen wasn't acting alone anymore. She had help, and they were trying to discredit not just me, but the entire task force. It became a matter of public security. We escalated the breach attempt to the state police cyber unit. They traced another access attempt to a printer at the HOA clubhouse, yes, the very building Karen once operated out of. That printer had been disconnected, supposedly out of commission, but it had a local memory cache. Inside were copies of falsified complaint letters, including one addressed to the state attorney general, accusing me of impersonating a federal agent. The situation had gone from bizarre to dangerous. The state police coordinated with our local sheriff to sweep Karen's house with a warrant. They found more forged letters, burner phones, and a series of hand-drawn maps showing routes in and out of the neighborhood, labeled with names and schedules of various residents, including mine. They arrested her again, this time for conspiracy to commit cyber intrusion, obstruction, and impersonation of a federal complainant. She was booked, denied bail, and placed in protective custody pending psychological evaluation. The judge finally ruled her a high-risk defendant and barred all electronic communications until trial. I was contacted by local media for an interview, but I declined. I didn't want to turn this into a spectacle. It wasn't about attention, it was about making sure she couldn't hurt anyone else. Still, the community needed answers. Attended the next town meeting and told the story plainly, what happened, what it meant, and why we needed to put safeguards in place to prevent anyone like Karen from ever taking power again. People listened, some nodded, some cried. The new HOA board voted unanimously to dissolve all executive enforcement powers for a 1-year probationary period. No more random notices. No more unannounced inspections. All disputes would now go through county code enforcement or neutral mediation. It was a quiet revolution. People began talking again. Neighbors checked in on one another. The toxic energy that once filled Mill Creek Preserve began to thin out. One afternoon, an elderly man named George walked up my driveway with a toolbox. I need help fixing. That busted camera? He asked with a smile. I said yes, not because I couldn't do it myself, but because it meant something that he offered. The paranoia was fading, and in its place, community was returning. But as for Karen, her trial was just ahead. The court combined her case as trespass, theft, conspiracy for a date for full proceedings. The judge warned that due to the volume of charges, she could face up to 15 years if convicted on all counts. She sat in silence, no longer ranting, no longer bold. Clipboard was gone. The blazer was wrinkled. She looked like someone who had finally realized the walls were closing in. Still, I knew the storm wasn't over. Because in neighborhoods like this, where power once ran unchecked behind closed doors, there's always one more secret waiting to crawl out. By the time the official paperwork hit her mailbox, Karen was already in full denial mode, spinning a narrative that she had simply been protecting the neighborhood from suspicious vehicles and following HOA safety procedures, never mind that she had broken a heavy-duty government padlock, trespassed onto private property, and unlawfully removed a vehicle registered under a federal joint task operation? She doubled down fast, calling an emergency HOA board meeting, where she painted herself as a hero who took initiative. When the authorities failed to respond to a clear neighborhood threat, what she didn't realize was that this wasn't some parking violation she could write off with a fine and a smug speech. This was a federal matter now, and people were watching. The sheriff's office had submitted its report to the DA within 48 hours. The local paper picked up the story just 3 days later. It was front-page news. HOA President illegally seizes police jeep in bold daylight move. The photo they used showed her mid-step, bolt cutters in hand, taken straight from my security footage. I handed over everything, video timestamps, the fake HOA notices, and even the orange sticker she slapped on my fence post like she had authority over the law. The DA moved swiftly, issuing a formal notice for Karen to appear at an evidentiary hearing regarding felony criminal trespass and theft of government property. But even then, she tried to spin it. She posted in the community Facebook group that it was a misunderstanding and a politically motivated smear campaign. That's when the neighbors began turning on her. People who once supported her strict code enforcement started asking questions. If she could break into my property and steal a Jeep, what else had she done behind closed doors? A few started to come forward. One man said she'll find him for using a non-approved shade of beige for his mailbox. Another family reported being harassed over a child's swing set. It all came pouring out. The HOA's board members, fearing blowback, began to distance themselves. One even resigned, releasing a public statement condemning Karen's rogue and reckless behavior. At the same time, the federal task force had completed its internal assessment. I was cleared of any operational compromise since I had documented everything and followed protocol from the moment the vehicle was taken. But the task force wasn't done. They requested that the DOJ step in to audit how a civilian was able to so easily access and relocate a government asset. That audit led to a new discovery. Karen had lied on her HOA presidency application, failing to disclose that she had 2 prior restraining orders from a previous neighborhood where she'd pulled similar stunts. In one case, she had tried to shut down a neighbor's backyard workshop by reporting him for hazardous fumes, which turned out to be nothing more than wood glue. In another, she had trespassed into a garden to inspect it for non-native plants. She had a pattern, a need to control, manipulate, and dominate under the guise of order. And now, that pattern was unraveling at full speed. The sheriff served Karen with a temporary restraining order barring her from entering my property or contacting me in any way. But she didn't stay quiet for long. She showed up at a town hall meeting ranting about neighborhood safety, accusing the sheriff's office of corruption, and even suggesting that I was using a fake badge and fake car to intimidate her. That was the final straw. I contacted my task force supervisor, and together we arranged for a press conference with full documentation, vehicle registration, task order numbers, photographic evidence of my federal ID, and confirmation from the DOJ that the Jeep had been in official service at the time of its removal. The local media showed up in force, and within minutes, Karen's lies crumbled on camera. She was confronted live by a reporter who asked, "Did you know the Jeep you removed belonged to a narcotics task force when you took it?" Denied it, then pivoted to say she thought it was a decoy set up to frighten residents. But the damage was done. That night, someone graffitied the HOA office building with the words, "Queen Karen of the Lawless," in bright red spray paint. I didn't condone it, but I understood the sentiment. People were fed up. Special meeting was called by the remaining HOA board to vote on removing her from office permanently. Despite her pleas and threats of legal action, the vote was unanimous, -27-0. She was stripped of her title, her access to HOA funds, and her community privileges. But the legal storm wasn't over. When Karen's court date arrived, she tried to delay it by filing a counterclaim against me. She alleged emotional distress, character defamation, and professional sabotage. The judge took one look at the video footage and threw out her claim on the spot. The real hearing moved forward, and the prosecution presented a timeline so airtight it left no room for her usual theatrics. I testified calmly, presenting the entire situation with dates, names, and verified evidence. The federal agent assigned to our task force backed up every claim I made. Karen's attorney tried to argue that she had acted out of community responsibility. But the judge reminded the court that no civilian, and certainly no HOA, had the authority to seize a government vehicle without a warrant or probable cause. The hearing lasted for hours. The ruling took less than 20 minutes. Karen was found guilty of trespassing, theft of federal property, and obstruction. Sentencing was scheduled. She was placed under court supervision pending further investigation into her past HOA abuse cases. I walked out of the courthouse that day not angry, not gloating, just relieved. I knew it wasn't about the Jeep anymore. It was about setting a line in the sand for people like her, people who think a title gives them the right to stomp on others. And trust me, we were only halfway through this saga, because what Karen did next after being stripped of her title and disgraced in front of the community dragged this neighborhood into chaos none of us could have seen coming. The trial began in mid-July inside a packed courtroom where even the hallway outside had people standing shoulder to shoulder, waiting to hear what would become of the woman who had once ruled Mill Creek Preserve with nothing more than a clipboard, a smug smile, and a total disregard for law and boundary. Karen appeared smaller than anyone remembered. No longer dressed in her HOA-branded pastel polos or her favorite navy blue blazer, but in a plain gray pantsuit, her hair flat, her face pale, and her hands trembling just slightly as the first. Of 5 charges was read aloud: trespassing, theft of government property, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit cyber intrusion, and felony fraud in the management of HOA funds, each one heavier than the last. The prosecution wasted no time building the timeline. How Karen had targeted me personally over a vehicle she knew nothing about. How she had forcibly entered a secured private property, cut a padlock that had federal registration, removed a surveillance vehicle used in live narcotics investigations, and attempted to misrepresent the situation to the community using falsified documentation. When her defense tried to argue that she had been operating under reasonable suspicion, the judge shut it down with a single statement: suspicion does not grant authority, and it certainly doesn't override the law. But what broke? The case open wasn't just my testimony or the sheriff's photos of the destroyed lock or even the footage from my security cameras. It was the discovery of Karen's fabricated complaint letters, traced to the HOA clubhouse printer, and the hand-drawn surveillance notes on my comings and goings. That crossed the line from entitled to calculated, from careless to criminal. The state's cyber division gave testimony showing how Karen's network of accomplices had tried to pull classified metadata from the Jeep's encrypted systems, which could have exposed live operations in the region, stunned the court. The tension in the room became a thick silence that clung to the air for the rest of the day. Her supporters, few as they were now, began to back away from the front rows. Some even walked out. By day 3 of the trial, her defense team had stopped trying to argue innocence and shifted entirely to mitigation. They presented letters from neighbors, most unsigned, suggesting Karen had simply been passionate and invested in community safety. But it wasn't enough. Because passion doesn't justify hacking police vehicles or laundering HOA funds through fake landscaping companies. The financial records showed clear paper trails: $12,000 rerouted to Karen's Greenscape Services, which had no business license, no office, and no existence outside a PayPal account tied to a prepaid cell phone found in her bedroom closet. At that point, the fraud case alone was enough to guarantee time behind bars. But the trespassing and obstruction charges layered onto it like bricks on a sinking ship. When Karen was finally called to testify in her own defense, the courtroom sat in absolute silence. She stood slowly, took the oath, and walked to the stand. Her voice was thinner than anyone expected. "I was trying to maintain order," she said. "There were rules. I just enforced them." The prosecutor asked one question: "Did those rules give you the right to break a federal lock and remove a police vehicle?" She paused. Her jaw trembled. And then, for the first time, she spoke without spin. "No," she whispered. "That was it?" Her silence after that was louder than anything she'd ever shouted from her HOA pulpit. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all 5 counts. Guilty. The judge scheduled sentencing and denied her request for house arrest pending the decision. Karen was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her once impeccable posture slouched, her eyes staring straight ahead like she couldn't quite process what had happened. Back in Mill Creek Preserve, word of the verdict spread like wildfire. People were stunned at first. Then they started to talk openly, honestly. For the first time in over a year, the neighborhood felt breathable again. Patrols, no fines, no suspicious flyers on mailboxes. The interim HOA board scheduled a community vote to permanently remove executive enforcement powers and turn all future compliance matters over to independent city code offices. The clubhouse Karen once controlled was cleared out and repurposed as a community space, no longer gated, no longer weaponized. One of the first events held there was a safety workshop hosted by the Sheriff's Department at the request of residents. It was attended by families, retirees, young couples, and even a few who had once supported Karen but now sat quietly, grateful the madness was over. I showed up, not in uniform, just in jeans and a ball cap, and people actually came up to me, thanked me. One woman, maybe in her 70s, hugged me and said, "You stood up when no one else could." That stuck with me, because the truth is, I hadn't planned on being a symbol of anything. I just wanted to protect my property, my work, and my peace. But Karen had turned a simple boundary line into a battleground, and I had no choice but to defend it. A few weeks after the trial, I received a formal apology letter from the HOA board acknowledging their previous failures, the damage caused, and their appreciation for my patience and resilience throughout the ordeal. They asked if I would consider advising them during the transition period into a new, non-authoritarian structure. I agreed, but only on the condition that any future president undergo a mandatory legal briefing on the limits of HOA power and that all enforcement attempts be documented, voted on, and subject to third-party review. They accepted every term. Meanwhile, Karen remained in county lockup, awaiting sentencing. Her supporters vanished, her social media pages were deleted, and the legend of her clipboard and bolt cutters became something whispered with embarrassment rather than fear. But I wasn't quite ready to relax. I replaced the gate lock with an industrial-grade electronic system. I added infrared to the camera array, and I buried 2 more encrypted drive safes in different corners of my land. Because if there's one thing I learned from this mess, it's that some people will go to insane lengths to control what they don't own. And it only takes one clipboard-wielding narcissist to plunge an entire neighborhood into chaos. Summer, I finally towed the Jeep back home. It had been cleared for redeployment and was now parked under a camo net with fresh gear, freshly aligned tires, and no Karen in sight. I stood on the porch that night with a glass of sweet tea, looked out over the gravel drive, and took my first real breath in months. The cicadas were loud, the stars were bright, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt still. But there was still one more chapter to go. Because what the judge would say at Karen's sentencing hearing would send one final shockwave through the community and deliver justice in a way no one, not even I, saw coming. The courthouse was quiet the morning of the sentencing, almost too quiet for what we all expected to be the final curtain on a year-long nightmare that had dragged an entire neighborhood through layers of chaos, corruption, and a spectacular fall from grace. I sat in the back row in plain clothes, not there to gloat or make a show of it, but because after everything that had happened, after my Jeep had been illegally towed, after I was falsely accused of impersonating an officer, after my security was compromised by a woman wielding HOA power like a badge, I needed to hear it with my own ears. Karen entered through the side door in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles, flanked by 2 deputies. She looked older, deflated, like someone who'd aged 20 years in 6 months. Her lawyer walked beside her, eyes forward, tight-lipped, as if even he had given up trying to find an angle. The judge entered promptly and wasted no time. The room settled. The charges were read again, the totality of her actions revisited in one crisp, brutal summary. 5 charges, 3 felonies, 2 state-level offenses. The judge's words were measured but firm, his tone leaving no doubt about the gravity of her choices. He recounted her trespass onto private land, the destruction of a government lock, the illegal seizure of a law enforcement vehicle, her attempted breach into sensitive digital systems, the manipulation of HOA funds, and the harassment of neighbors through coordinated disinformation and property vandalism. He emphasized that her actions had not only endangered a federal investigation, but had eroded public trust within a suburban community that had relied on her for leadership. He said, "You were elected to guide. You chose to dominate. And now you'll answer for every step you took beyond the line of law." When it came time to speak, Karen rose shakily, cleared her throat, and said nothing at first. Then she muttered. A short apology read from a trembling hand. "To the residents of Mill Creek Preserve, I wanted to bring order. I went too far. I see that now, but it wasn't enough. The prosecution recommended the maximum allowable sentence under state and federal guidelines." The judge paused, removed his glasses, and delivered the blow. "Karen Mitchell, this court sentences you to 8 years in state prison, with 2 years suspended under mandatory supervised release, and you are barred from holding any HOA, municipal, or neighborhood enforcement office for life." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. 8 years, she slumped as the deputies moved in. But the judge wasn't done. He added, "And upon completion of your sentence, you will be required to complete 300 hours of court-supervised community service under the supervision of the same sheriff's department you tried to undermine." That part was poetic. Karen would eventually work side by side with the very law enforcement officers she once tried to outmaneuver with bolt cutters and bluff. The press didn't swarm the courtroom, but the story made its rounds headlines. In local outlets, a short segment on regional news, and a brief appearance on a national HOA abuse of power expose. But in Mill Creek Preserve, the impact was seismic. It wasn't just that Karen had been sentenced, it was that justice had finally caught up with someone who had built an empire out of fear and self-importance. Neighbors felt safe again. Children played in yards where fences once bore compliance tags. Community cookouts returned. And the boardroom of the old HOA clubhouse became a reading room and game night center for seniors. The clipboard was gone. The lock-cutting crusader had fallen. And peace, that sweet, unassuming peace, returned like an old friend no one thought they'd see again. As for me, I went back to my normal life. The Jeep was back in commission, rotated between fieldwork and training demos, always parked behind reinforced fencing with updated surveillance. I received an official commendation from the task force for handling the situation with remarkable discretion and integrity. But I didn't need the plaque. Just seeing the community rebuild itself was enough. One afternoon, I stood on my porch as a group of teenagers biked past my driveway. One of them stopped, pointed toward the Jeep, and asked, "Hey, mister, is that the one she tried to steal?" I nodded. The kid's eyes widened. "Whoa, legend." I chuckled, took a sip of tea, and just said, "Let's hope there's no sequel." And I meant it. Because this wasn't just about HOA overreach or neighborhood drama. It was about standing firm when someone tries to take what's not theirs. About fighting back not with fists or rage, but with evidence, patience, and law. Karen thought she could bend reality with enough paperwork, enough threats, enough bluster. But the truth doesn't bend for bullies. It waits. And then it knocks them down in front of everyone. So if you're someone dealing with your own HOA horror, if you've faced intimidation behind fences and bylaws, let this story be your proof. There's always a way through. Just keep records, stay calm, and when the time comes, let the law speak louder than the clipboard. And if you love true justice stories like this one real neighborhood drama, bold Karens, and lawmen who won't back down, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Sham Stories right now, because the next tale might just be bigger, crazier, and even more satisfying than this one.